Okay, now you should be on flowchart number 3. Flowchart 3 is complicated, but this basically is like where most of the conference is going to take place. And so I could have separated into 2 different flowcharts. I don't know if that would have helped or hurt, but I decided to do it this way. That's why you'll see on some of the boxes there's a tremendous amount of text. I generally don't like doing that, but I think for our purposes that's going to be most helpful. So by the time we're on to flowchart 3 in the committee meeting, the procedural hurdles have been cleared and it's time to begin discussing the topic. And that's why at the very top it says formal debate on the agenda. We're talking about whatever the first topic was, and because you're Cameroon, we're going to assume that you made the motion and it passed. And so the first topic is going to be the global implications of climate change, followed by eliminating nuclear weapons, right? Throughout the conference, you're going to be discussing and negotiating with other delegates who are representing their countries and trying to form an agreement and come up with an agreement that's beneficial to them. You're trying to come up with one that's beneficial to Cameroon and is in line with what Cameroon believes. And so the negotiations, the discussions, the debate that are going to take place, there are basically 2 methods of doing it. And there are some variations, but this is important to know just the 2 basics. There can either be a moderated caucus, which we haven't talked about yet, or an unmoderated caucus, right? And a caucus, by the way, is just like a gathering of people who are discussing things. Moderated versus unmoderated. And once again, I'll remind you that at some conferences, instead of calling it an unmoderated caucus, they call it a suspension of the meeting. So first I want to talk about the similarities between moderated and unmoderated caucuses. In terms of the similarities, both of them have a set duration of time at which they expire. And so whether somebody's making a motion for a moderated caucus or an unmoderated caucus, it's going to include some set amount of time at which the caucus is going to expire. The differences are really important, though, and really significant. As you know, in an unmoderated caucus, there's no restriction on the topics that can be discussed. Once the delegates get up and walk around and start talking amongst themselves, people can talk about anything. And so some people may be talking about, if you're talking about the global implications of climate change, some people may be talking about the impact of coal on climate change. Some people may be talking about how lower developed countries still need to use coal because they aren't able to provide electricity to their populations. Other people might talk about the effect of the beef industry on climate change. Everybody could be talking about different things, and there's no speaking time either, because in an unmoderated caucus, people just talk, right? Sometimes real powerful delegates will hold the floor and speak a lot. We'll talk about what you can do to make sure that doesn't happen. But an unmoderated caucus is unmoderated. People can talk for as long as they want about whatever they want. In a moderated caucus, a specific topic has to be identified. A narrow, specific topic has to be identified, and it has to be included in the motion. And then second, in terms of speaking time, as I said, there's no restrictions in an unmoderated caucus on speaking time, just a limit on the overall duration. And ideally in an unmoderated caucus, if you're working with a group, you want to make sure that everybody has an opportunity to give their input. And so we'll talk about strategies by which you can try and prevent delegates from sort of like taking over and being real powerful. We call them power delegates, them taking over and sort of trying to run things. So we'll talk about that later. But the chair isn't walking around saying, hey, you've been speaking for too long, now give this person a turn to speak. The delegates are doing it. In a moderated caucus, a speaking time has to be established, and it also has to be included in the motion when you're motioning for a moderated caucus. So if you look at flowchart number 3 and look at the box in the upper right-hand corner where it says moderated caucus, let's assume for the sake of discussion that you're Cameroon, right? And you want to discuss, the agenda has been set to discuss the global implications of climate change. The speakers list was opened, right? You motioned to open the speakers list. It was accepted, and you're the first person on the speakers list. You've spoke, a bunch of other people have spoke, and then at some point the chair says, are there any points or motions on the floor? If you want to motion for a moderated caucus, you would say something like, thank you, Honorable Chair and fellow delegates. Cameroon moves for a 9-minute moderated caucus with a 45-second speaking time on the topic of the impact of the beef industry on climate change. Right? Structurally, what's going on is you've set the length of time, the speaking time, and the topic. So here's the important things to remember. The length of the speaking time has to divide equally into the overall time of a moderated caucus. If you move for a 9-minute moderated caucus with a 45-second speaking time, that means that 12 delegates are going to be able to speak, right, for 45 seconds exactly, right? Whether they use them up or not, So think about it this way. What if you propose a 5-minute, you say Cameron motions for a 5-minute, moves, I apologize, see I'm still learning the language and the terminology. Cameron moves for a 5-minute moderated caucus with a 45-second speaking time on the impact of the beef industry on climate change. Does that work? Well, if you do the math, right, it doesn't, because 6 speakers will be able to speak for 45 seconds and there'll be 30 seconds left over, right? Whatever the speaking time is, it has to divide equally into the overall time. So a chair is going to rule that motion dilatory. Now, again, oftentimes if the chairs are cool, they'll just give you an opportunity to pick a different time and make sure that they match up. So it's no big deal if you make a mistake. But there's only certain amounts of time and they're divisible into certain amount of time. So you should know like ahead of time. If you're doing a 9-minute, it can be 9-minute with 45 second. It can be 9-minute with 30 second. If you're going to do an 8-minute, figure out what those are ahead of time. And we practice that in simulations. You shouldn't be thinking up a time and a speaking time off the top of your head at a committee. You should already be thinking about that and already know what times you're going to be looking for. Now, in order to speed things along, one of the things that happens at some conferences is experienced delegates will use a slightly different terminology than what I have on the flow chart. So what they'll say instead is they'll say, thank you, Honorable Chair and fellow delegates. Cameron moves for a 9:45 moderated caucus on the impact of the beef industry on climate change. Sometimes they'll say Cameron moves for a 9:45 on the impact of the beef industry on climate change. And basically it's understood that the first number is the length of the time of the moderated caucus and the second one is the speaking time, right? And nobody's getting confused about that. So here's what I would say. If other delegates use that kind of terminology first, and if the chair doesn't object, feel free to use that kind of terminology. Use the shorter version if you want, right? But don't do it first. I want you to learn and practice saying it properly. And that would be, once again, just to reiterate, thank you, Honorable Chair and fellow delegates. I'm trying to find my place on my list here. Cameroon moves for a 9-minute moderated caucus with a 45-second speaking time on the impact of the beef industry on climate change. That's the proper way to do that motion. What we'll talk about next are the outcomes that can happen if your motion is accepted and then voted on. And we'll talk about that in the next video.